Flex Wheeler won numerous competitive titles during the 1990s, including the Arnold Classic 4 times and Ironman Pro 5 times.
But that was the most perfect physique I'd ever seen up close in my life.
When I found out I had the disease in '99, it was so rare at that time before they even confronted me and told me about it.
I need overall fullness and thickness everywhere. I need to bring up my calves. I need a wider back. I need a more broader chest, and from there on to give myself a more front lateral V.
In the world of 90s bodybuilding, plenty of guys were huge, but Flex Wheeler was different. His shape was so balanced it almost didn't seem real. Broad up top, tight through the waist, legs that flared like they'd been built in perfect symmetry. Other pros would quietly admit, this guy had the best genetics they'd ever seen. They called him the Sultan of Symmetry, and for a while, it looked like nothing could stop him. But away from the spotlight, life kept throwing punches. First, a devastating car crash.
I was exhausted because my diet was just a liquid diet because I couldn't handle food yet from the car accident.
Then a rare kidney disease, and years later, the amputation of his right leg. This is the rise, fall, and survival of Flex Wheeler, the most gifted bodybuilder who lost everything. Kenneth Flex Wheeler was born on August 23, 1965, in Fresno, California. His childhood wasn't the glossy movie opening type. Money was tight, and home life came with its own challenges. He's spoken openly about growing up with dyslexia. In school, the words on the page seemed to twist and run away from him. Reading out loud was a nightmare. Kids laughed, teachers got frustrated. But in a small Fresno dojo, none of that mattered. There, his body listened, and his mind finally found some peace. That's where Flex was born, not from bodybuilding, but from the splits and speed he'd mastered in martial arts.
If we were in a ring, then, it's combat, and, I love combat. It's nothing I love more, any sport more than martial arts.
Years later, another mentor, a former Mr. Universe named John Brown, would teach him how to use that same discipline on a bodybuilding stage. And by his teens, the weight room entered the picture. At first, it was just a way to get stronger for martial arts, but strength has a way of hooking you. Every week, the bar felt a little lighter, and the mirror showed a little more shape. Fresno gyms weren't packed with future Mr. Olympia contenders, but Flex stood out, his joints small, his muscle bellies full, his proportions almost cartoon, like even without serious bodybuilding training. He wasn't chasing any trophies yet, but the raw material was there. Coaches and training partners would tell him he had something special. And while he brushed it off at the time, it planted a seed that would soon grow into one of the most talked about physiques the sport had ever seen. By the mid-1980s, Flex Wheeler was no longer just that guy in the gym with good genetics. He'd started dabbling in competitive bodybuilding, first on the amateur circuit. These weren't glitzy stages with camera crews. More like local high school auditoriums, where the stage lighting was a single spotlight, and the trophies looked like they came from a bowling league. But Flex's physique didn't need fancy production to stand out. By now, his days started before sunrise. Cardio in a quiet gym, a quick shower, then off to work. Lunch was cold chicken and rice in his car, then back to train until closing time. His mentor, two-time Mr. Universe John Brown, drilled him on stagecraft, making him hold poses until sweat rolled down his face, and rehearse transitions until they looked entirely effortless. That discipline would soon turn him into a name everyone in bodybuilding knew. From the beginning, his shape stopped people in their tracks. Wide, rounded delts that hung like armor plates, a waist you could nearly wrap your hands around, and legs that flared naturally without the blockiness so many others struggled with. Even in an era that prized sheer size, Flex's proportions were so on point that people started calling him the Sultan of Symmetry before he'd even turned pro. And what made him dangerous was how fast he improved. A competitor might spend years adding a few pounds of quality muscle. Flex seemed to add it between shows without losing his lines. His posing, too, was different. Smoother, almost like a martial artist moving through a kata.
And we only have 10 minutes to display, all of us. And I still 7 seconds, 10 seconds. And I still 7 seconds of that 10 is not fair for the other 4 people up there.
Each transition flowed into the next, giving the illusion of effortlessness. By the late 80s, whispers started circulating beyond California. Other amateurs knew his name. Some pros even stopped to watch when he hit the stage at NPC events. Flex was quietly rewriting what the ideal male physique could look like. And soon, a leap into the professional ranks would test whether that shape could stand against the biggest names in the sport. Flex Wheeler's professional debut in 1993 wasn't just good. It was the kind of season that forces the entire sport to stop and reevaluate. He didn't tiptoe into the pro ranks. He walked in like he'd been there for years. His first big test came at the Ironman Pro Invitational. Most rookies take years to crack the top spots. Flex walked in with veterans whispering he was just a pretty body. Backstage, he stayed quiet, running every pose through his mind the way Brown taught him. His training was surgical. Endless sets, perfect form, and no wasted motion. By the time the lights hit him, the judges weren't looking at a rookie. They were looking at a problem for everyone else. He took first place with a look that was all balance and flow, proving you didn't need to carry the sheer mass of a Dorian Yates to command the stage. His conditioning was razor sharp, the result of John Brown's brutal stage drills, forcing him to hold poses long past the point of pain so he could stay rock solid when it mattered. And the way he posed, it was like he'd been choreographing these routines for a decade. Controlled, fluid, confident. Barely catching his breath from that win, he went straight into the Arnold Classic. That show had history and a deep lineup of veterans. Flex didn't blink. He won there too, beating seasoned pros who had already stood at the Olympia. That's when the nickname Sultan of Symmetry really took root. By the time he landed on the Mr. Olympia stage later that year, the sport was buzzing. Could this be the man to topple Dorian Yates, the reigning mass monster? That year's Olympia didn't give him the crown, but his runner-up finish in his rookie year was unheard of. Fans left the arena with one thought: if he's this good now, what happens when he's at his peak?
About bodybuilding in, I didn't know about dieting in, I didn't know about diuretics. I mean, I'm very honest. I took one.
The 1993 Mr. Olympia was the kind of matchup bodybuilding fans live for. On one side, Dorian Yates, the Shadow, a man whose physique looked like it had been built in a factory, grainy, dense, almost alien in thickness. On the other, Flex Wheeler, the human blueprint for proportion, symmetry, and clean lines. When they stood next to each other, it was like two different sports colliding. Dorian's back was a wall of muscle, his conditioning so extreme it bordered on surreal. Flex's silhouette, though, was flawless. Every muscle flowed into the next, no rough edges, no awkward angles. Even veterans backstage admitted privately, this is the most perfect structure we've ever seen on a bodybuilding stage. The call-outs that night were electric. Every time they hit a pose, the crowd would erupt for one, then roar for the other. Dorian's granite density versus Flex's artful balance became the narrative of the show. When the dust settled, Dorian retained his crown, but Flex had landed second place in his very first Olympia. That result wasn't just a silver medal, it was a shot across the bow. In an era obsessed with sheer size, Flex proved aesthetics could still stand along with mass. The judges had made their call, but fans left, talking about how close the future felt. And that future seemed to be barreling toward him, until a single moment on a California road nearly ended it all. On June 9th, 1994, Everything changed for Flex Wheeler in the space of a few chaotic seconds. He was driving in California when his car spun out of control and crashed hard. The impact left him with a broken neck in 2 places.
I won my first pro show after breaking my neck, and then I took second. After Ronnie goes,
Not a strained muscle, not a slipped disc. A broken neck. Doctors were blunt. He was lucky to be alive, and luckier still not to be paralyzed. For a bodybuilder whose livelihood depended on precision movement, this was the nightmare scenario. Even if he recovered enough to walk, the chances of returning to elite-level competition seemed impossibly slim. The hospital room became his new arena. White walls, the constant beep of a heart monitor, the faint smell of antiseptic. This was his stage now. Instead of clanging plates and cheering crowds, his days were marked by nurses checking vitals and physical therapists urging him to lift his arm another inch. Flex later admitted that this was the first time he truly considered life without bodybuilding. The man who had just gone toe-to-toe with Dorian Yates was now being told to measure progress in baby steps, not pounds on a barbell. Friends and fans began to assume his career was over. But if there's one thing bodybuilding teaches you, it's that growth comes from breaking down and rebuilding. And Flex wasn't ready to let the crash define his story. The months ahead would be brutal, slow, painful, and uncertain. But somewhere in that recovery, the spark to return began to burn again. Flex Wheeler's return wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There was no single "I'm back" moment. It was quieter, slower, and far more grueling. He spent months relearning how to train without aggravating his neck, building back the muscle that had withered during his recovery. The man who once moved through the gym like a panther now had to think about every rep, every range of motion, every ounce of weight on the bar. But Flex had something most athletes don't after a near-career-ending injury: the kind of muscle memory and structure that couldn't be erased. Even at 70%, his proportions still looked better than most pros at 100%. He used that to his advantage, focusing on perfect form and precise presentation while slowly regaining his size. By 1995, he was back on stage. And by 1997, he had recaptured the magic. That year, he won the Arnold Classic. Not just once, but again in 1998, 2000, and 2001. At a time when many competitors would have faded into what could have been status after such an accident, Flex had re-established himself as a consistent threat at the top of the sport. His posing was smoother than ever, his symmetry untouched, his confidence restored. Fans noticed that he now carried himself with a different kind of poise, less like a cocky rookie, more like a man who knew how fast it could all be taken away. And in 1998, that poise and polish would carry him to the biggest stage in bodybuilding for one of the most controversial showdowns in Olympia history. The 1998 Olympia was a storm waiting to break. Dorian Yates had retired earlier that year, leaving the throne wide open for the first time in 6 seasons. For many fans and analysts, this was Flex Wheeler's year. He had the shape, the experience, and after years of grinding post-accident, he was finally peaking at the right time. When he stepped on stage in Las Vegas that September, the crowd reaction confirmed it. Flex looked incredible. He brought a package that balanced everything: conditioning, full muscle bellies, and the trademark symmetry that made him the sport's visual benchmark. His waist was tiny, his quads swept like an artist's brushstroke, and from the front and side, he seemed untouchable. But standing across from him was Ronnie Coleman.
out of those two, of course, Ronnie. I mean, geez, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? You can't outwork the guy because he's just a mule. He's just gonna work.
A man who, until that year, had been considered an outsider in the title race. Ronnie had arrived with a level of mass and detail the sport had rarely seen, and the judges took notice. pose for pose, it became a clash of philosophies. The mass monster versus the aesthetic master. When the final call-out was announced, the decision shocked many. Ronnie Coleman was crowned Mr. Olympia for the first time, and Flex took second, the closest he would ever get to the Sandow Trophy.
And I won the Ironman, and then I won the Honor Classic. Okay, see, I took second in the Honor Classic, and
To this day, fans debate that outcome. Some swear Flex had the superior shape and flow. Others believe Ronnie's combination of size and conditioning was undeniable. What's certain is that 1998 cemented Flex's legacy, not as the champion on paper, but as the man many still believe should have been. For most bodybuilders, a second-place finish at the Olympia would be the pinnacle of their career. For Flex Wheeler, it became a frustrating pattern. Year after year, he would show up with a physique that, by all visual accounts, looked unbeatable, only to walk away with the runner-up or third-place trophy. After 1998, he remained locked in the top tier. In 1999, he came in sharper, denser, and more seasoned. Yet Ronnie Coleman had leveled up too, adding even more size without losing detail. Flex would again take second. In 2000, he looked spectacular, winning the Arnold Classic earlier that year. But the Olympia stage still favored Ronnie's overwhelming mass and muscle maturity. Fans began calling Flex the uncrowned Mr. Olympia, a bittersweet title that spoke to his consistency and his curse. The irony was painful. He was too good to fall out of the top spots, but the judging trends of the era leaned toward freakish size over aesthetic perfection. Still, these near misses only deepened his mystique. Every time Flex walked out under the lights, people leaned forward, wondering if this would be the night the Sultan of Symmetry finally toppled the mass monster era. But while the battle on stage was ongoing, a quieter, more dangerous fight was brewing inside his body, one that had nothing to do with lifting weights and everything to do with survival. While Flex Wheeler was battling Ronnie Coleman for bodybuilding's biggest title, he was also fighting something far more dangerous and far less visible. Behind the flawless lines and polished posing routines, his body was waging a quiet war against itself. Flex had been diagnosed with a rare hereditary kidney disease called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis.
Well, I found out I had disease, and that was rough because all my contracts left. They ran like the Black Plague.
It's a condition where scar tissue forms in the kidney's filtering units, slowly impairing their ability to remove waste from the blood. Left unchecked, it can lead to kidney failure. For a bodybuilder consuming massive amounts of protein, supplements, and sometimes diuretics during contest prep, this was a ticking time bomb. In public, Flex kept it quiet. He still trained, still competed, still stood side by side with the biggest names in the sport. But in private, he dealt with fatigue that went beyond contest prep tired. There were times when his body simply wouldn't respond the way it used to. His legendary recovery slowed, water balance became harder to control, and extreme dehydration before shows put his kidneys under even more strain. By 1999 and 2000, whispers started. Not about his illness, but about why he wasn't adding the same kind of mass as his competitors. Most didn't know the truth. He wasn't holding back for aesthetics. His body simply couldn't handle the same brutal approach without risking total organ collapse. Eventually, the disease would force him to make a decision no champion wants to face. Step back from the stage. For someone like Flex Wheeler, retiring from competition wasn't a single announcement or one last victory lap. It was a gradual, reluctant fade from the bright lights. In the early 2000s, his kidney condition was becoming harder to hide, and the stress of contest prep was no longer something his body could tolerate without serious risk. He kept showing up for big shows, the Arnold Classic, the Olympia, but the Flex of 2002 and 2003 was different from the Sultan of Symmetry that stormed the stage in the 90s. The lines were still beautiful, the posing still flawless, but there was a hint of softness, a loss of that razor's edge that once had judges leaning forward in their seats. The toll of illness, years of dieting, and heavy training had begun to show. By 2003, the decision was made for him. His kidneys had deteriorated to the point where continuing in the sport could have meant complete renal failure. That year marked his final Olympia appearance. There was no big send-off, no victory speech, just Flex stepping off the stage, knowing it was the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. For a man who had built his identity around being one of the most complete physiques in history, letting go wasn't easy. Retirement meant more than leaving behind the competition. It meant finding out who Kenneth Wheeler was, without the Flex Wheeler mystique. But the battle with his kidneys wasn't over. In fact, it was about to enter its most dangerous phase. By 2003, Flex Wheeler's kidney function had dropped dangerously low. His doctors made it clear, without a transplant, he was on a countdown clock. The years of pushing his body to extremes had collided with his hereditary disease, and now survival, not stage placings, was the only goal. In 2004, Flex underwent a kidney transplant. The donor was a relative, a gift that literally kept him alive. The surgery was successful, but it came with a new reality. As a transplant recipient, he would need lifelong medication to prevent his immune system from rejecting the kidney. These drugs saved his life, but also altered it, causing side effects like muscle loss, fluid retention, and changes to his overall metabolism. The stage-ready, Flex Wheeler physique was gone, replaced by a different kind of strength. The ability to live within strict medical boundaries and still move forward. Training was scaled back, diets were less extreme, and the days of extreme dehydration before competitions were over forever. But while his competitive career was over, his life still had more battles ahead, ones even he didn't see coming. After the transplant, Flex Wheeler knew he couldn't return to the stage as the same athlete who once stood toe-to-toe with Ronnie Coleman. But he wasn't ready to walk away from bodybuilding entirely. Instead, he found a new role, one built on sharing the knowledge and discipline he'd spent decades mastering. Flex became a mentor to up-and-coming athletes, often reminding them that genetics might give you a head start, but discipline keeps you in the race. He coached competitors on posing, training intensity, and stage presence, areas where he'd always excelled. His eye for symmetry and balance became his trademark in coaching, just as it had been in competition. He also worked with supplement companies, appeared at expos, and gave seminars around the world. Fans who had once cheered for his victories now came to hear his perspective on chasing goals, dealing with setbacks, and building resilience. And unlike some retired pros, Flex didn't sugarcoat the sacrifices the sport demanded. Yet beneath this reinvention, his health was never far from center stage. The transplant had extended his life, but it hadn't erased the damage his body had endured. Even as he inspired a new generation, Flex quietly faced another battle that would make headlines years later, one that would take more from him physically than any competition ever had. In 2019, Flex Wheeler was hit with news that would shake anyone to their core. Years of circulation problems in his right leg, linked to his kidney condition and the accumulated wear of decades in the sport, had reached a point of no return. Doctors gave him two options: risk his life by keeping the leg or amputate below the knee. For a man whose identity had been built on sculpting the perfect physique, the choice felt like a nightmare. He later called it the darkest moment of his life.
I was in a hospital and I told myself, I said, when I wake up, after they take my leg, as soon as I look down, if I'm okay with it, I'll be all right. If I freak out, I'm gonna have a bad fight. When I woke up, I was like, I'm okay with this.
After decades of crafting every inch of his body, Part of it would be taken away in a single surgery. The operation was a success, but it was far from the end of the fight. Fans across the world, from casual gym goers to legendary pros, flooded social media with messages of support. Many wondered if this would be the blow that finally broke him. Instead, Flex tackled it with the same discipline that had carried him through every stage of his career. Rehabilitation was grueling. He had to relearn how to walk, balance, and move without constant pain. The gym became a place of adaptation rather than domination. Exercises once second nature now required precision, patience, and humility. But bodybuilding had taught him how to adjust, and he embraced his prosthetic as part of his new identity. Flex began sharing his journey openly, using his platform to inspire anyone facing their own battles. He spoke candidly about depression, pain management, and the mental grind of recovery, breaking the stereotype of the invincible athlete. And just like that, his message shifted from winning titles to winning at life. Flex Wheeler's life has been about a lot more than perfect poses or silver trophies. He's taken hits most people wouldn't come back from and still found a way to stand tall. Maybe not on the Olympia stage, but in a way that matters even more, proving that real strength shows up when the lights are off and the crowd is gone. If his story inspired you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of legends who refuse to quit.